Hey guys, Phoebe Lawler here. So I thought my first video would be sharing my story with cystic fibrosis. I know, boring, but let's face it, I've got no creativity whatsoever. So basically I was born with cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease that affects the lungs and pretty much all the organs of the body, and eventually it shuts down everything. In a nutshell, it's terminal, which means you're going to die from it, which sucks, but you know, life is life. So it's progressive, which means it gets worse as you get older. So here's my story. I was diagnosed with CF by a heel prick and sweat test at 6 weeks of age. I was born unable to breastfeed and unable to bottle feed. I was vomiting every little sip of breast milk or bottle milk that my mum tried to feed me. So this was due to gastroesophageal reflux disease, GORD, from my CF. So when I was 7 months, I had a Nissen fundoplication. Here's my scar from it. As you can see, it goes all around the tummy. Basically, they wrap your stomach around your esophagus to prevent reflux from coming up. Because the reflux was getting so bad that they had no other option. And that nothing could save me from it, basically. And I could not have, they wanted to work me up to the surgery at 11 months, but I was too sick for that. I had to have it straight away. And apparently I had 3rd-degree burns all the way down my esophagus. So it was pretty serious. By the time I was 3, I had my first, what they call a tune-up, which is where they bring us into hospital for IVs. And treat us with lots of extra physiotherapy, intense physiotherapy, and intense IVs to try and get rid of a lung infection. So I'd have one about every year, a couple years. By the time I was 10, I was diagnosed with CF-related diabetes, because what CF does in our pancreas is it stops the insulin from producing. So we have to we eventually often stop producing insulin, and we have to inject it ourselves. I was also diagnosed with osteoporosis because of our malabsorption disease. It affects the bones, so my bones got quite weak very young. By the time I was 12, I had mono or glandular fever, which made me very, very sick. Unfortunately, that's when everything declined. That's when my lung function went from 80% down to 30%. I was on oxygen for over a month. I was in a wheelchair. I couldn't walk because I was so short of breath. I was very, very, very sick. I got diagnosed with chronic pain syndrome. I was in absolute agony, and I just basically, I'd had enough. The one thing that was, though, is that I did manage to go to the Taylor Swift concert with help of my doctors, who got me an oxygen concentrator, wheelchair, everything. And so that was absolutely amazing. I will never forget that time of my life. And then, so from then on, I'd have tune-ups about every 2 to 3 months, because I'd gotten that sick that I'd lost a lot of permanent lung function. I'd lost about 50% permanent lung function. I was never going to gain it back, so I got very sick very quickly, and I kind of deteriorated by then. By the time I was 15, I had ketoacidosis, DKA, because my diabetes was so severe. I had ketones of 26. I was in ICU for a week. And I had an arterial lining. God, that hurt. I had all sorts of like PICC lines. For those who don't know, a PICC line is a central line. It goes into the arm, up into the heart. It gives you intense IV antibiotics and IV fluids. By the time, so I was very sick. I was on high flow oxygen and everything, and by the time I got out of ICU, I was admitted for another tune-up, which wasn't very unusual for me anymore, because I'd have them about every 2 to 3 months. By the time I was about 16, 17, I decided to get my first port. I'm now on my 4th port, but basically a port is also a central line, but it's surgically inserted under the skin, and they just prick it with a needle when you come into hospital, rather than having to have procedures every time to get a line put into your arm. It's so much easier, but I am on my 4th port because my first one flipped. So instead of pointing down towards my heart like it was supposed to, it was up towards my head. The second one, what did the second one do? The second one cracked. So it had just been used so much that it just cracked. The inside the port actually cracked. The third one blocked. So I'm now on my 4th port. All the rest of my ports were right here under my boob. So I've got this one in a much better place, which is the upper chest. So that's a lot better for me. By the time, anyway, so those are the port stories. But by the time I had DKA, I was very sick. And then a couple years later, I finally decided it was time for a port after all those PICC lines. Like they couldn't feed them up through my arm anymore, because my arms were just so dead, and like I just had so many that I've got all these lumps and bruises, permanent bruises and scarring on my arms. And they just couldn't feed them anymore, so it was time for a port. So this one I've had since June last year, and yeah, so, and then a couple of years later, I got septic. So because I get chronic kidney stones with my CF, that's another thing I forgot to mention. When I was 12, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney stones because of my CF due to the malabsorption disease, and also probably partly due to the fact that my dad has them, and so did my grandfather. So basically I had all these kidney stone surgeries, had lithotripsy, I had kidney stones fished out, and somehow with the surgery I got septic. For those who don't know, sepsis is where the body starts to attack the virus. So it's basically blood poisoning. It's very serious, and I almost died. My organs were shutting down. So hang on just one sec. So basically, it's caused by the body's response to an infection. I shouldn't have said it's the attack. It's not really the attack. It's more basically your body, like, it can get sepsis from anything. So it can get sepsis from a splinter, a bruise, a cut. You can get sepsis from anything. And it's basically where your body just starts to shut down because of the infection, and it's very scary, and it was honestly the scariest time of my life. Then afterwards I had refeeding syndrome, which is basically where I think it's your potassium, your phosphate, and something else is all lowered down. Can be very serious. I had a feeding tube for months on end. Basically they have to reintroduce your body to food. So that was very scary, and that was from the sepsis because I was unable to eat. And then that's that. So since sepsis, I haven't really had any just support issues, just constant tune-ups all the time, but that's pretty much my life story, and I've managed to tell it in 12 minutes, so go me. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Sending so much love to you all.